The question must be asked, what suffers? Within this temporary context, there is no denying that suffering is a component. But what is it exactly that is doing the suffering? We are aware of suffering, to be sure, but is it awareness itself that suffers? Or is it just the physiological biology that is subject to suffering? Without question, awareness cannot suffer, or for that matter be the direct recipient of any kind of feeling, emotion, or sensation. There needs to be a middleman of sorts that awareness must plug into in order to gain access to sensations. So therefore it is awareness's attachment to a physical form that facilitates awareness's awareness of the pain and suffering of a physical form. So this is why suffering is not an absolute objective indication of any kind of truth about anything. It is a mere component among many relegated strictly to the realm of physicality. And even so, it is not even an absolute objective indication of any kind of truth about physicality. It is completely relative and subjective to configurations of distinction that are the conditioned associations of meaning assigned to a variety of sensations. The very fact that this conditioning can be tweaked and modified is an indication that the suffering is not specifically anchored to be absolute or objective. Some may say that these alternatives are not normal, but this idea of normal is another conditioned distinction of assigned meaning. There is no such thing as normal. Just because a majority of items share something in common does not translate into anything other than an agreement. This agreement by no means supports any absolute objective truth. Truth itself is not even truth, but yet even more conditioned distinctions created out of nothing and only sustained through some kind of agreement. Even truths that seem infallible and constant are only applicable to within a temporary contextualization, meaning they are not really absolute or objective in the larger scope. So normal means nothing other than a shared commonality of familiarity. Fact is, anything that manifests or appears in any given spectrum, even if very rare or only appearing once in a given timeline of a limited spectrum, it is completely normal. If it appears or maintains some kind of presence, it is normal. It would be more accurate to say that something is common or rare. But normal and abnormal are streamlined distinctions, skewed to support the security of groups who seek to cling together in conglomerates of agreement based on familiarity, which thereby stigmatizes anything that does not fit the mold of this annexation of sameness. And while majority may rule, a majority does not necessarily equate into an absolute indicator of right or wrong. Right and wrong, more conditioned distinctions upheld by assigned meanings that define the agreed-upon categories. So suffering is a subjective sensation dependent on an awareness's attachment to a physical form. But even within the context of physical form, suffering need not be unpleasant or even felt as a sensation. You've heard about mind over matter, right? You may want to make another distinction and dismiss it as make-believe, but it is a relevant functioning aspect of the contextualization. There are people who are able to switch off physical pain. This might be rare, but it is completely normal. It's just that the majority of people don't know how it is accomplished. And I know it's more convenient to dismiss these things as tricks or illusions so that we may cling to our pain and play the role of a helpless, hapless victim that's being imposed upon. This, while the vast majority of these poor victims don't even know what real pain and suffering is. It's funny how the most vocal opponents of suffering tend to be privileged, spoiled brats living in a free society. And yes, you are privileged, even if you are poor. There are plenty of people in the world that would trade places with you in a second. And these people truly know what suffering is. They are oppressed, living in deep poverty, replete with disease, famine, torture, and squalor, and yet they are the last ones to ever complain. Yet white males, many of them living at their parents' expense or on the government dime, in decent neighborhoods who have access to clothing, clean water, medical facilities, and all the modern conveniences of a free society, are the first ones to complain. You don't really suffer, which means you are not an empathizer but a sympathizer. You pity the life that actually does suffer. And pity bespeaks arrogance and guilt. You care. Then try actually doing something about it. But you won't do anything about it because you have no clue about what real deep suffering is. In the end, complaining won't get the job done. Talk might be useful, but only if in negotiation with key players that can get things done. And isn't it an odd coincidence that the majority of people who know the secrets of mind over matter tend to be people who come from conditions of prevalent suffering? It's understandable that people who suffer so little would not understand that with real prolonged deep suffering comes tolerance. Not tolerance of people accepting something that's perceived as unacceptable, but an actual physical tolerance to pain and suffering. But the spoiled complainers cannot conceive of this because they are very sensitive to pain and suffering due to their physical tolerance of pleasure and comfort. But, believe it or not, there are people with very high physical tolerance to pain and suffering. People that, if you punched them in the face, they wouldn't even flinch. In fact, they might even smile. And this connects to another prevalent aspect. There are people out there who actually enjoy pain and suffering, and not just masochism, although this is an example of such, but this is mostly tied into sexuality. There are ordinary folks out there that enjoy the sensation of pain and suffering in non-sexual ways. How is this accounted for? Since we've already thrown out playing the abnormal card, will you now transmute it and say they are sick? Well, they are not sick. In fact, most of these people can be easily identified with because they are mostly found in free societies. This is an aspect almost exclusively related to privilege, something that free societies know a lot about. Overextended, prolonged pleasures, conveniences, comforts, and gratifications also builds up a physical tolerance. And this goes a long way in explaining the cranky, discontented conditions of the spoiled complainers. It's too much, too fast, too soon, and for too long. And this lays down the grounds for a disposition very similar to like a drug addict who can't achieve the perfect high anymore. And shortly after, alienation sets in. What started out as comfortably numb soon turns into just plain numbness. A discontented numbness that doesn't serve as a lead-in to detachment will just lead to the craving of sensation that pleasure simply cannot fulfill anymore. So then, ironically, for some, pain becomes the sensation that makes these people feel alive. Want to call it sick? Fine. Then privileged societies are sick. Oversatiated with pleasure, people become incapable of love, alienated and disconnected from each other, which ultimately leads to them making connections through pain, drama, conflict, and activities generally defined as on the negative side of the spectrum. Sound completely strange? If we are dismissive of awareness and at the same time unwilling to discard desire, there is no possibility to transcend suffering. But see, this is a strange hypocritical irony. It's a paradoxical catch-22 that brings to mind a hamster on a wheel. Desire begets suffering, but without desire, this existence isn't a game worth playing. The only way to fix it is to remove suffering, but the only way to remove suffering is to remove desire. In other words, let's throw out suffering, but keep everything else. Explain exactly how this is possible. Name one other instance ever where something was thrown out, but its opposite was kept. The next line of reasoning is that duality is understood, but it's the polar extremes that are the problem, right? If we could only remove the extremes, then everything would be fine. Duality is only duality because of the polar opposite extremes, which set the parameters of the paradigm. All the moderate mediums that people generally prefer are only sustained as such because they are sandwiched in between the extreme contrasts that give them the distinction. A person doesn't have to fall prey to the perils of extremes, but nevertheless, the risk of such is always there. So if you can understand that moderate sustenance brings moderate deprivation, and moderate desire brings moderate craving, why is it not clear that extreme sustenance brings extreme deprivation and extreme desire brings extreme craving? It's not for anybody to judge someone else's condition, what they deserve or do not deserve. Duality is not broken and needs not be corrected or fixed, as if any human being is an adequate authority with their limited relative subjective perspective to re-engineer duality and cause and effect. It's functioning perfectly, just as it should be. It's not unbalanced, out of harmony, ununified, fundamentally flawed, or the result of some random incompetent luck. Duality is deliberate, purposeful, balanced, harmonized, unified, perfectly systemized, and the result of reliable, impeccable intent. It's not even a matter of intelligence or unintelligence. It's got everything to do with the imagination. If a person has a perfect dream, this is not any indication of intelligence. Just as if a person has a nightmare, it's not any indication of unintelligence. If we are discontent with the apparent laws of an illusion, then our only solace is to either disconnect from it, or simply to start imagining greater things. People know what they like and know what they don't like, but are unwilling to jump at the chance of being rid of what they don't like if it comes at the cost of surrendering what they like. In other words, they are willing to give up one, but not both. Granted, disconnecting from the illusion is very rarely realized as possible. It would be lonely, boring, unfulfilling, an empty limbo void of stagnation. Non-duality is none of these things, or any other kind of distinctive label of associated familiarity. Non-duality is outside of everything we know, and therefore cannot be defined or made familiar by anything we know. But it can be known, but the only way to know it is to experience it empirically. And we can only directly experience it by detaching, deconstructing, disconnecting, and shutting down the thinking mind that tyrannically oppresses the spirit with thought, beliefs, distinctions, discriminations, and preferences. People don't want to hear this. They wouldn't mind surrendering certain aspects, but they certainly don't want to surrender at all. You're going to have to surrender it all anyway upon your death. So why not get a head start? People don't see this as a viable option. So then your only option is to start imagining greater things and emulate the condition you wish to see in your environment. If you can govern the internal, then you can govern the external. Of course, the most ideal thing that you could hope for in this context would be to bring about a kind of monoality within duality. Duality is already balanced. So if we want to have a more moderate, temperate existence, then we need to reconfigure ourselves to be in tune with the natural laws of duality. The only reason there is so much suffering, conflict, discontent, extremes, and disharmony is because people are completely out of whack with the natural flow. So duality is not the problem. We create the problem. And the reduction of suffering enabled by being in tune with the natural flow won't be brought about by intelligence, but by wisdom. In fact, it could be said that intelligence is mostly responsible for creating the mess we endure. So then comes the question of what is the wisdom and intelligence of a contextualized dualistic paradigm that even has suffering as a component. Even in the absence of the human element, we see the ruthless impersonal aspects of nature. So isn't this indicative of a sloppy, incompetent, stupid system? Despite the progression of consciousness and intelligence through various forms, moving from instinct to self-awareness, evolution apparently only applies to form, which basically casts consciousness as an inconsequential byproduct of form to be dismissed. Yet consciousness is evolving and will continue to evolve. Why is there this unspoken assumption that evolution stops with mankind? Evolution doesn't stop here, and there's every indication, despite mankind's behavior, that higher evolution will involve more intelligence, higher consciousness, widened awareness, and a reduction of suffering to such an extent it will almost be non-existent. There will be balance with nature, correctly applied intelligence, supreme wisdom, higher callings, and a new contextualization. So it really is ignorant to complain about imperfection when perceived perfection is a long, evolving, progressively unfolding process. This is refinement. If you don't like this process, then sorry, you were imposed upon. Death will be upon you before you know it. Death will be upon you before you know it. This whole misanthropic, dogmatically scientific philosophy of the spoiled, privileged malcontents has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of absolute objective truth, but everything to do with subjective psychology spinning relative judgments and opinions. There is no such thing as absolute truth. And even for things that everyone agrees on are not absolute truth either, but rather only relative to a limited contextualized paradigm. And anyway, you will be hard-pressed to find anything that everyone agrees on, and certainly suffering is not one of them. If anyone was to ever arrive at an objective philosophy, this would only be accomplished by disconnecting from the psychology and experiencing what is there in its absence. The thinking mind of a psychology of a person never even gets close to anything that we could call objective. All it produces is relative subjective distinctions, thoughts, beliefs, opinions, judgments, and discriminations. The antithesis of objectivity. We can only access the objective if we unplug from all of this. And the most viable way to do this is meditation. A bunch of phantasmagorical nonsense, right? So then, unfortunately for you, your only escape from your warped, discontented psychology is death. It's really a no-brainer. So much unnecessary suffering occurs due to desire. So obviously, if you really are genuinely concerned about reducing or eliminating suffering, you'll eliminate desire. To say that life is not worth living without desire is foolish, especially since the people that say so have no frame of reference to make such an assertion. You haven't even given it a chance, and therefore have no experience of such to say otherwise. It's incredibly pig-headed to be such a strong opponent against the suffering, while at the same time to be so astonishingly selfish as to not give up desire, which you know damn well is the cause of suffering. It's disgustingly hypocritical. It reveals what's really behind these contrived arguments is just self-interest, hedonism, egoism, attention-seeking, and addiction, satisfying cravings and compulsions, and indulgence and gratifications. Anger at the fact that life can't be just nothing but selfish pleasure. Believe it or not, life is more than just about sensations. This is ultimately the function of suffering, to push us into a different direction that's not completely all centered around pleasing a self. Advanced, meaningful existences cannot manifest until this body-centered slavery to emotions, feelings, sensations of desire and suffering are mastered and overcome. That's the answer to surpassing suffering, but of course not the answer that angry, hedonistic addicts of sensations want to hear. And so what is the alternative? Well, at least the misanthropes have been nice enough to shelf their Nazi ambitions of genociding the human race and have now come up with the less depraved, insidious option of antinatalism. Antinatalism is such a useless suggestion as a panacea of suffering. Of course, if there's no life existing, there can be no suffering. But what the cranky antinatalist pleasure addicts don't want to see is that life is not dominated by suffering. The vast majority of people live lives that provide a well-balanced variety of sensations, and this includes poor people, the majority of people, who live in a multitude of different degrees of poverty, oppression, hunger, and exploitation. Even wild animals spend a very small amount of their individual lives just suffering. There's a whole lot more to life than just suffering. And if you really went around and actually talked to people who really actually suffer, the overwhelming majority of them would not opt for euthanasia, would not condone genocide, nor would endorse antinatalism. Antinatalism is not the answer to suffering. Certainly, responsible natalism is. When you see babies that are starving and living in conditions of squalor, drought, and famine, it's quite obvious that the parents are in no position to support it, are irresponsible to have having it, and are indeed imposing suffering on a sentient being that deserves better. Not to mention that we are overpopulated, and people have far too many babies per family than is necessary. But truth be told, as populated as we are, there is more than enough food, water, shelter, and resources to go around for everyone. The real problem, one that creates and sustains much of the unnecessary imposed suffering, is corrupt, greedy, selfish power structures. The same ones that torture and cage animals and set up slaughterhouse industrial complexes. The same ones that start wars and use people as cannon fodder. The same ones that profit from people being subjugated as objects in the crime, drug, prison, and military industrial complexes. The same ones who pollute and disrespect the planet for their immediate satisfaction. But even so, it's not the case that only the upper 1% enjoy life while the rest of the world suffers. In fact, in most cases, it's just the opposite. In people who truly suffer, you will find joy, big hearts, enduring character, and the true appreciation of life. In people who are satiated in pleasure and luxury, you will often find sorrow, heartlessness, zero character, and a deep hatred of life. Kind of like our self-elected heroes of suffering who are privileged yet are full of hate, malice, spite, and contempt. If you are complaining about it, but not uprising against the greed and corruption, and instead pointing the finger at everything but the greed and corruption, and offering solutions aimed at some type of depopulation, instead of overthrowing the greed and corruption and building a system rooted in community sharing and fairness, then you are a coward, plain and simple. But then, of course, how can we get rid of greed and corruption when we we are unwilling to rid ourselves of desire. To solve the problems, we don't need red herrings. We want to take a look at the problem and take a look in the mirror. And the answer to the problem is not killing yourself, but to rid yourself of greed, corruption, selfishness, arrogance, desire, and suffering. If you really do care, which you don't, you can't possibly help anyone else until you help yourself. What all sentient creatures need is your love and compassion. But you cannot give sentient creatures love and compassion until you give yourself love and compassion. And of course, love and compassion are hard to come by when your main objective and concern is selfish, addicted attachment to desire and hedonistic pleasure, that which manifests ugliness and suffering within ourselves. And even with all of this said, nothing really matters in the end. You have the right to feel any way you want, but all in all, you don't matter. No sensation, whether suffering or pleasure or anything else matters. And suffering isn't the only important factor in the universe. Please, please, get over yourself. A mind and a body may suffer, but this is not who you ultimately are. When all of this is over, you will be wiped clean of everything. There will be no scars, trauma, damage, or wounds. Kind of like waking up from a nightmare. You will be unscathed, unscratched, and unharmed. Is this what you really long for? If so, then go for it. If not, then do your part in addressing the problem, not by looking outside of yourself, but by looking within yourself. If there is any problem to be found, this is where you're going to find it. You are not a victim. You are responsible. Look within and take responsibility.